Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Gregory Burke, Director of the Power Plant, and welcome to this afternoon's lecture. For the fifth year running, Art Toronto has commissioned the Power Plant to develop a talks and lecture program for the fair, and we are very pleased to present this year's lineup of speakers. I would like to welcome you this afternoon to our third and final Power Talk by art historian Thomas Crow, the Rosalie Solow Professor of Modern Art and an Associate Provost for the Arts at New York University. We would like to extend our thanks to our partner here and the entire Art Toronto team at the fair. Our booth at the fair features a work by the artist Ian Wallace, who spoke here yesterday and who was the subject of one of our two current exhibitions at the Power Plant. Wallace's exhibition, The Economy of the Image, and the Californian artist Pei White's exhibition, Material Mutters, are currently on show and feature also the result of our 2010 commissioning program. These exhibitions are on view from 12 to 6 p.m. Tuesday to Sunday. Unfortunately, we are closed tomorrow. The Power Plant is just a 5-minute walk south of the convention centre. So if we wrap up before closing, I'd urge you to get down there to see the shows. Now, Thomas Crow is the author of two influential studies of 18th century French Painters and the Public Life in 18th century Paris, published in 1985, and Emulation, David Jouard and Giraudet in the Art of Revolutionary France, and that was published in 2006. Subsequent publications, including The Rise of the Sixties, American and European Art in the Era of Dissent, and the essay collection Modern Art and the Common Culture, both published in 1998, examine the later 20th century, while The Intelligence of Art from 1999 analyzes specific moments in the history of art. Artists he has written specifically on include Christopher Williams, actually for a publication that I edited in 2001, and his most recent texts also focus on single artists including Gordon Matta-Clark, Robert Smithson, Robert Rauschenberg, Ed Ruscha, Bob Dylan and Harry Smith, Roy Lichtenstein and Damien Hirst. And I should also mention that Tom is also on the editorial board of Art Forum and publishes regularly in that magazine. The Power Plant is indebted to our funders, the Canada Council for the Arts, the Ontario Arts Council and the Toronto Arts Council, and our partners at Harbourfront Centre. Our public programs are generously supported by primary education sponsor CIBC Wood Gundy. Now, after the talk, Tom will take some audience questions. But once again, please wait for the microphone before asking a question, as we are recording the event for our archives. Now, please welcome Thomas Crow.
Well, many thanks, Greg, for that introduction and for the invitation to be here. I always enjoy coming north of the border. And to all of you, really, for turning out late on a Sunday afternoon. I'm grateful for that, too. I'm among the three speakers, unlike Ian and unlike Thea, I'm not going to be talking about things you can actually see or do on the occasion of the art fair. But the subject is all about a kind of intersection between art and commerce. The subject did seem to us that it would have some pertinence to the occasion. It's an expression of what I'm finding is a kind of stubborn preoccupation on my part with Andy Warhol. Even though Warhol might be really the most familiar of artists and the most sort of thoroughly examined, one might assume, nonetheless, things keep popping up that it seems to me haven't really been explained, and that explaining them would have some bearing on a larger field of interest than just Warhol himself. And in this instance, it really has to do with why did Andy Warhol become a fine artist, a gallery artist, in the first place in 1961 or 1962. I mean, it's been narrated, he's told his side of the story, but I'm not sure that just knowing the how or when tells us as much as we need to know about the why. Because he had a flourishing career as a graphic designer and illustrator, certainly in financial return far beyond what most of his peers as fine artists were able to command, even some of the most successful ones in the 1950s. So why change is my question. And I'm going to try to address it by starting out with, I think is the best way to do it, with a visual example. Early in 1962, the commercial photographer Art Kane photographed his friend and colleague Andy Warhol. Kane posed him naked from the waist up, as you see, arms crossed over his midsection and covered in gold paint from his hairline to his collarbone. So we're looking at a rather remarkable portrait of the artist just at the juncture where he is making the transition between the two worlds of graphic design to fine art. Now, Art Kane was bringing two different career perspectives to this particular session. Because back in the early 1950s, when he was still in his 20s, Kane had been the art director of 17, the teen fashion lifestyle monthly magazine. His predecessor at the magazine, Joan Fenton, had given Warhol one of his very first illustration assignments when the young commercial artist had just migrated to New York City from Pittsburgh and was hustling work in the city. Now, the fact that Kane replaced Joan Fenton would have certainly made Warhol acutely attentive to him as a person. He was the sort of arbiter or decider in the magazine world to whom Warhol would regularly have sent little notes and gifts and drawings and mementos to keep him, in the minds of the people who could provide him with work. But in the intervening years, their two respective vocations had converged in a way that made them more like peers rather than employer and employee. Because from 1956 or so, Art Kane had begun making the transition from editorial design, where he had started, to a full-time identity as a photographer. And by 62, he'd really ascended the freelance ladder himself, such that his affinity with Warhol now, at the time that he took the picture, would be one of a comparatively successful provider of visual content for the editorial and advertising world. Another thing that they had in common was kind of warm familial roots in the immigrant working class. This Art Kane was born Arthur Kanofsky in the Bronx, and he devoted some of his most accomplished early photographs to portraying his father Herman behind the wheel of the taxi cab that he drove. And in this one, the interior mirror reveals the son behind the viewfinder of his 35mm SLR. Now, as Warhol was well known for sharing his Lexington Avenue townhouse with his Slovakian immigrant mother, the pairing of these two might have made sense on many levels to the agency that put them together. Kane's Warhol portrait came about as an advertising commission for a kind of take-out brochure stapled into a number of different magazines. Advertising the superiority of certain coated and embossed papers manufactured by the Champion Paper Company of Ohio for use in offset printing. As I said, it took the form of a heavy stock insert, because it was the actual paper that was being advertised, was the material on which the ads were printed. The reference to the paper's suitability for both photograph and artwork corresponded to the two differing media in which Kane and Warhol specialized. And the structure of the ad was symmetrical in that Warhol supplied an answering portrait of Kane, shown in profile with his trademark horn-rimmed glasses, rendered in vigorous dark graphite over a rust-colored watercolor ground. Now, it's something important to remember that Warhol did this drawing at the same time that he was kind of transitioning from his early, comic strips, appliance advertising, nose jobs, and just getting to the point where he's going to be doing his first movie star portraits. But his old skill as an illustrator was still at hand and available to a commissioning entity like Champion Papers. We see this compressed rectangular vignette, which is suspended over a slightly larger field. This is kind of a hot projection of the slide. It's a little more muted than this in actuality. It's suspended, as I said, over a slightly larger field of thin ochre wash, and then the whole ensemble is surrounded by more wash in complementary colored sort of blue-green. If Warhol's drawing relies on contrasting layers of delicacy and vigor, which it does, the entire exercise of the Champion Papers advertisement overlays and conflates really nearly every aspect of Warhol's complex practice and social identity at this point. He's still firmly enveloped in the commercial world. He, just like Kane, steps readily into the role of pitchman for a product. The merchandise in question, though, is not just any expedient, consumable good, but material of a certain artistic refinement and authority in itself. And here's Champion Paper's own, self-description. Because the paper is itself the substrate of the ad, the reader is in a position to judge the truth of the copywriter's claims with his or her own eyes and fingers. And its insert form invites the owner of the magazine to remove the ad and treat it as itself a work of art in multiple form. And each artist is quoted in these small snippets you see in the yellow columns on the subject of the other, in a way that reinforces the status of the ad as the mass-produced equivalent of one of Warhol's own trademark keepsakes. Their two statements, while doubtlessly drafted with some ad professional assistance, are striking in the way that each seeks to amplify the charge of meaning that each has put into the portrait of the other. Kane begins by exempting his friend from the cliches of Kennedy-era commercial glamour. He says, Andy Warhol is no 20th century stainless steel antibiotic blast-off personality. So, he's at pains in this breezy string of adjectives to exempt him from what we might see as the basic stereotypes of pop art, really expressed here even before the category of pop art had been firmly established in the popular mind. Instead, Kane ascribes to his subject, as well as to that subject's representation, an aura of timeless artistic value. He says, I think of Andy as a Greek from the 4th century BC. He's as classic as the gold paint he prefers to use. And first I thought of photographing him as a gold head, but as the gold makeup at the neckline met the skin tone of his chest, I saw the whole Andy revealed. Here stands Andy, a Greek sculpture, an ancient in the atomic world. End of quote. Now, while Kane was surely thinking of the drawings that Warhol had done in the latter part of the 50s of gilded shoes and boots and sort of ephebic male nudes, though these were in fact rendered not in gold but in a sort of art shop bronze leaf called Dutch metal, which is I think worth knowing. I think Kane might have been forgiven for thinking of the very well-paid career that his friend had been able to generate from what looked like a casually offhand drawing technique. So Warhol was the golden idol in two different senses of that term. The archaic manner of the pose and the image, Egyptianizing, I think, as much as Greek, also appears to jibe with the later Warhol's famous Sphinx-like refusal to reveal himself in words. But Warhol's own tribute to Kane is gushingly metaphorical and professionally chatty by turns. He says, quote, I think of Art Kane as being strong, say, like a pumpkin beam in a blue sky, like the sun. Art beams his eye straight at his subject, and what he sees he pictures. And it's usually a dramatic interpretation of his personality. And so I decided to draw his face with directness, because Art himself is so direct. But instead of making a giant face, or even just a big face, I thought it would be marvelous, just for fun, to make a smaller face. End of quote. Now, you'll noted that neither one of them says a thing about the product, which reinforces the fine art feel and authority of the sales pitch. But that comes via the convincingly sincere aesthetic efforts evident in each image, along with these supplementary verbalizations that I've just read to you. So they become one with Champion Papers, delivering an endorsement, demonstration, and palpable manifestation of the product at a level beyond the powers of any mere endorsement. Now, it's more than tempting to discern in both portraits anticipations of the work that, just in a matter of months, as I was saying, the work that was going to make Warhol exponentially famous, far beyond the commercial community evoked in this advertisement. His rendering of Kane compresses a likeness into a heavy black emblem imposed over a field of somewhat arbitrary color. Its blocky shape lends it the character of a reproducible unit. The famous gold Maryland of 1962 similarly isolates a rectangular stamp-like effigy of the dead star's face in the middle of a larger amorphous ground. But I think it's Kane's rendering of Warhol, with its stillness, its symmetry, its mask-like opacity, that appears to manifest a more profound anticipation of that elegiac painting of Marilyn. So what then does the Champion ad, about which I've gone on at some length here, suggest to us about the ways that Warhol's unending commercial career might be better understood? As the paintings that Warhol made with his factory assistants between 1962 and 1966 have risen to their present heights of critical and art historical estimation, his earlier career as an illustrator has become a correspondingly serious area for examination. But just as Warhol, the successful fine artist of the 1960s, stands apart from his former peers in the commercial realm, the work of the 1950s becomes annexed to the later career, and unfortunately divorced from the efforts of the other commercial artists of the 1950s, like Art Kane, working around him. That is, divorced from the work that actually informed and lent definition to what Warhol was doing for the whole first decade of his career. So I think it becomes imperative to search out more peers, models, and rivals like Kane, beginning at the start of Warhol's New York career, and then to track the rapid evolution of illustration and design between 1949 and 1962, if his self-transformations are to be comprehensible beyond the enigmas of an individual temperament. The little drawing of Kane belongs to a distinctly diminishing category in Warhol's overall artistic output, but he's not through yet. Here, for example, is a Harper's Bazaar cover from 1962, which brings forward the kind of signature drawing style that had established his reputation much earlier. While Kane's portrait of him signals what would become over the course of the 1960s the ascendant practice, that is, photography, with his friend becoming a photographer of choice for the new rock music aristocracy in both California. This is an extraordinary photograph from the bottom of a swimming pool of Sonny and Cher, or in the UK, indeed. The Champion Papers insert thus represents, I think, a certain contest of the media within the realm of commercial design. And I think it is that contest which, as I hope we'll see, propelled Warhol to redefine himself as a gallery or fine artist. Now, familiar anecdotes attached to Warhol's transition between the commercial and fine art spheres ascribe his adoption of some of his most characteristic devices and subjects to the promptings of other people. His adoption of repetitive motifs like the dollar bill canvases were supposed to have come from a dealer, whether it was Eleanor Ward of the Stable Gallery or the lesser-known Muriel Leto, who has also been credited with the idea for his most renowned motif, that is the can of Campbell soup. Now, to the extent that Warhol did follow the promptings and suggestions of others, his behavior represents a fairly straightforward transfer from one sphere to the other of the kind of professional striving and open complicity that had impressed commercial patrons like, say, Tina Fredericks, the precociously successful art director, the youngest in the history of Condé Nast, who first recognized the distinctive gifts of the young Pittsburgh transplant to the New York fashion and publishing scene. As their relationship continued, she came to value Warhol over his peers because of his unfailing adaptability. Quote, this is quoting Tina Fredericks, "He was so willing to go with you, like he was willing to do anything. And that's very different from most people." Let's see, now where do I want to go? Back here, yes. But of course that kind of behavior violated in nearly every respect the conventions of creative autonomy that governed negotiations in the fine art sphere. And for a while, that was what seemed to be, an unbridgeable impediment to Warhol making any headway in New York. It took the former Knoll furniture salesman, Irving Blum, in Los Angeles, to see Warhol's attitude as a potential strength rather than a debility. As a result, Warhol's first major exhibition would take place at Blum's Ferris Gallery in LA, in advance of his finally stepping up to both Stable and ultimately to Castelli Gallery in New York. Warhol's strength and weakness opened up the established art world in unprecedented ways. So much is absolutely clear in hindsight. But what the keen-eyed Irving Blum saw in him represented an array of skills acquired in the commercial design world, from which both the artist and the dealer had emerged. Prominent among Warhol's aptitudes was a measured attitude toward the value of originality. Sorry, I shouldn't have mixed up aptitude and attitude in one sentence. But in any event, his qualified respect for the idea of originality, which is, of course, perfectly at home in the commercial art world, was new to the fine art world, but immensely valuable, it turned out. That is, knowing just how much and how little of that perceived quality he really required. One early exercise in negotiating that continuum gained him a medal from the New York Art Directors Club in 1952, when he was still, in fact, very, very young. His entry in their competition was a poster, a commission he'd received, advertising a CBS radio series called The Nation's Nightmare on drug addiction and delinquency, which later appeared as a record album. And this is what I'm showing you now is the sleeve of the record album. In answer to this brief, Warhol came up with ink and wash drawings of white tufts and leather jackets in what might be termed the prevailing manner of social concern in draftsmanship, one indelibly linked to the signature style of Ben Shawn. The art directors at CBS had been for some time employing Ben Shawn, who was an old Popular Front artist and illustrator famous for his painting about the execution of Sacco and Vanzetti, perhaps above all other works. But he had embraced the wide audiences for post-war graphic design as what he thought of as an extension of his populist principles, those populist principles that had made him the standard bearer for the American political left. Shawn's principled reputation and fine art credentials made him an ornament for CBS, that is, in those days, a broadcast organization aiming for a prestige identity above the level of its competitors. But the Cold War political climate was rapidly changing the competitive field, because Shawn had for some years been the object of FBI surveillance as a suspected subversive. So Warhol was increasingly enlisted for commissions that would, without this kind of blacklisting beginning to overtake Ben Shawn, would have gone, of course, to the older and more famous artist. Warhol's immediate and salient problem had been to parlay his admiration of Shawn, which was genuine. He collected Shawn's work, to take that and turn it into a manner that was reassuringly familiar to Ben Shawn's admirers, yet different enough to be taken as more than a cheaper knockoff. I'm showing you a study for the Nation's Nightmare poster. when his friend and Carnegie Tech classmate, George Klauber, declared that, quote, people used him when they couldn't get Ben Shawn, he voiced precisely the snap judgment that Warhol had to overcome if he was going to emerge as a genuinely desirable talent in his own right. The drawings that he assembled for the Nation's Nightmare poster and the later record release present an early but decisive answer to that dilemma. I'll put these two together here. The whole kind of mise en scène of the illustration is the tough Brooklyn docks, summarily indicated by the spare angular outlines of the freighter which link the two figural vignettes together. But that marker of industrial grit and criminality, 3 years before on the waterfront, at the same time projects a kind of calligraphic, insubstantial lightness that extends from the contours of the addict at the top through the brawling pair of traffickers at the bottom. And his means to this end lay in the technique that was going to serve him right through the 1950s, namely his blotted line process, perhaps a little more visible here, whereby he reserves the direct application of ink not to the surface you see, but to an intermediate surface which is then turned over and blotted onto the second surface, which becomes the final drawing. In this case, the blotted line technique is very evident in the interior, and he's gone over it with a heavy continuous line, so you can actually see a strong contrast between the two techniques. Now, it wasn't like a traditional counterproof where you have an image and then you impress it onto another surface, because the ink would dry too quickly for that to happen. So he would make this kind of hinged contraption and do a little bit of each drawing at a time, and then blot it over and then turn it back and do a little more until he had the image he wanted. So the apparent continuity of any final contour was the outcome of an additive process yielding a suspended chain of bead-like spots rather than the decisive staccato broken lines directly applied to the paper, which was the signature manner of Ben Shawn. I think without that delicacy of effect, it's questionable whether the sensitivities of a 1950s mass audience would have tolerated the confrontational brutality of the needle plunging into the pale inner arm. Warhol, as you can see, thought and rethought that particular vignette, judging from the preliminary drawing where the addict is looking forward and down at the point of insertion rather than away and over his shoulder. In the drawing, Warhol also permitted himself a kind of blonde prettiness to the boy that becomes a sort of compressed semi-simian caricature in the final version, with the largest area of the head devoted to a picturesque pattern or cap of hair, and the countenance replaced by an elegantly economical configuration of just ear and a strained tendon in the neck. The wash passages efficiently evoke the crumpled folds of a hoodlum's leather jacket, but they achieve that effect with a paradoxical delicacy, more conventionally associated with a floral watercolor than an urban documentary. His assistant would describe Warhol's, one of his assistants would describe his typical approach with ink and colored washes, which he made out of Martin's dyes rather than watercolor per se, quote, he'd put it on very heavily and then it would sort of thin out, and sometimes you'd get these blotty effects as if you'd put some watercolor and it would sort of flow. He liked that kind of unevenness. Well, also in 1952, Warhol took the place that Shawn had occupied in the production of educational and promotional materials produced for the Upjohn Pharmaceutical Company. His representation of a gnarled and distorted hand graced the cover of this Upjohn pamphlet devoted to rheumatoid arthritis. And I think in this case, graced seems exactly the right word, in that the blotted line conveyed disfigurement and distress without any kind of repellent sting of the grotesque. So there would be truth in the maxim that Andy Warhol regularly found his own way by doing what others told him to do. Here he was challenged to craft an individual identity for himself in a realm of documentary subject matter that wasn't temperamentally his own. But once in place, those procedures launched him into the more compatible sphere of fashion, where an audience of art directors and consumers were more than prepared to savor the nuance and the undisguised artifice that came to the fore when it was liberated, when these qualities were liberated from any requirements for didactic impact or strenuous expression. The opportunity to make that leap, in fact, arose from his old Ben Shawn affinity, an art director who had worked on an American propaganda magazine that was sent to the Soviet Union in the early 50s. That employed him to do his kind of documentary style images. But then this director, Peter Palazzo, moved on to become in charge of advertising for the upmarket New York shoe brand, I. Miller. Now, Warhol had already done shoes for Tina Fredericks and another editor from Glamour called Geraldine Stutz, and then she had moved to I. Miller. So you had Palazzo and Stutz together, and they called immediately on Warhol to launch him into a high-profile weekly exposure in the New York Times. Geraldine Stutz recalled, Andy was a perfect natural, because I knew him, Peter knew him, he had done the shoe things for Glamour already. And for them, Warhol evolved a mode that combined recognizable uniformity with the animating quality of individual life in the blotted line. In Stutz's words, everyone understood that this was a breakthrough in advertising. It was something that had not been done before, and that the quality of Andy's work was beyond illustration. Now, that kind of praise from inside the fashion world may come as no surprise, but less expected would be its echo in the critical writing on Warhol by Benjamin Buchloh, perhaps the contemporary art historian who is most sternly vigilant against the blandishments of commercial culture. But Buchloh has celebrated these advertisements for Warhol's shrewd assimilation of contemporaneous avant-garde pictorial devices. His essay in the landmark catalog for the Museum of Modern Art Warhol Retrospective in 1989 stands really as a watershed in Warhol's critical history and historiography. Because it's easy today to forget the degree to which Warhol had generally, before that, been taken as a kind of cultural symptom or a crass opportunist in virtually everything that passed for serious commentary on him. That is, before Buchloh's essay was published. Not only did Buchloh definitively break this pattern, he offered a comprehensive template whereby Warhol could be seen to have rehearsed virtually every salient device of advanced art in the 20th century, and done so with disarming sophistication. For the purposes of my discussion this afternoon, what's most significant about Buchloh's critical intervention lies in his attention to the commercial illustrations of the 1950s. as he argues, and I'm quoting, "A more extensive study of Warhol's advertisement design would suggest that the key features of his work of the early 1960s are prefigured in the refined arsenal and manual competence of the graphic designer. Extreme close-up fragments and details, stark graphic contrast and silhouetting of forms, schematic simplification, and most important, of course, rigorous serial composition." In amplifying this hypothesis, he adduces several examples from the I. Miller campaign, these two. In his eyes, layouts like these confirm that Warhol had already grasped the full range of the painterly strategies, this is I'm quoting now, painterly strategies of Johns and Rauschenberg. In particular, those aspects that would soon determine Warhol's own pictorial production, end quote. Buchloh points to the overall regularization of non-relational composition, this is his language, as in the obvious example of Johns' flag paintings since 1954. Another, he argues, quote, shows the impact of Rauschenberg's direct imprinting techniques and persistent use of the indexical mark making since his collaboration with John Cage on the tire print. Well, while Buchloh's general observations are more than persuasive, these particular instantiations of Warhol's debts depend on certain assumptions that remain open to question. Buchloh gives the date of Rauschenberg's tire print, which of course I show you unfurled in the lower part of this slide, as 1951, but its actual date was 1953, when both Cage and Rauschenberg were at Black Mountain that summer. But by 53, Warhol had been honing his blotting and imprinting technique over some years already. This scenario further depends on Warhol possessing concrete knowledge of Rauschenberg and Johns' new works at or very near the moment when they were first being made, when there's actually little or no evidence for any such contact before Johns and Rauschenberg were shown by Castelli in 58 and 59. As to Warhol's deploying Johnsian non-relational composition, meaning arrangements based on uniform grids and repeated units, that aspect of the I. Miller ads was not, in fact, Warhol's sole or even major responsibility. Peter Palazzo offers this capsule summary of their way of working, quote, "Andy and I would discuss the ideas to make sure that they were compatible. I would then make design and composition suggestions in rough form, and Andy would go off and interpret them in his blotting technique method. Usually I give an artist the composition, even perhaps the color composition," end quote. Now, while it might be objected that every contributor to an admired project gives pride of place to his or her own contribution in retrospect, Palazzo's account is supported by Geraldine Stutz. She said they had the concept all set actually before Andy began, end quote. So the overall conception of the I. Miller advertisements was in every respect a joint project. That recognition, considering the inaccessibility of fine art parallels like those of Rauschenberg and Johns, I think leads us to the conclusion that the incipient avant-gardism in Warhol's advertising arrived via some distributed intelligence readily available within the professional design community itself. And it was this formation that produced, and I'll use Buchloh's persuasive recognition again, that, quote, "key features of the work of the 1960s are prefigured in the refined arsenal and manual competence of the graphic designer." It's just that it wasn't only Andy Warhol, but in fact an array of peers out of whose dialogue these devices emerged and that equipped him for his ultimately decisive impact on the art world of the 1960s. With even a schematic knowledge of American graphic design, it's not difficult to identify where that distributed intelligence resided. One obvious source would have been the designs commissioned by James Laughlin, the poet and Ezra Pound protege, who had founded the New Directions publishing house in the 1940s. Its mission, funded to a great degree by Laughlin's inheritance from his also Pittsburgh family, but a Pittsburgh family at the very top of the economic and social hierarchy in that city. Its mission was to supply a growing body of post-war educated readers with paradigmatic, modernist, or merely esoteric literature, drawn from both Europe and the Americas, in a format that was both inexpensive and flattering to their cultural aspirations. Designer Alvin Lustig, who was responsible for the lion's share of New Directions covers, mined the devices of the early 20th century avant-garde to lend the titles of that imprint a spare and incisive elegance, playing to the fact that the larger part of the list still carried an exotic charge for American readers. Warhol contributed his own New Directions covers on occasion. This is an early one from 1951. A characteristically blotted line Cupid cocking his bow in the viewer's direction. This was for, as you see, Ronald Furbank's three more novels, an author later elevated by Susan Sontag to the canon of camp. But the most decisive contribution, of course, came from Lustig, and beside his illustration and typography, it lay in the incorporation of photography into the cover designs. His striking manipulation of black and white images owes a patent debt to such exemplars of the 20th century avant-garde as Man Ray or Moholy-Nagy, overlaid by evocations of European avant-garde film in the vein of Louis Buñuel or Jean Cocteau. Here's a kind of collage of Lustig designs. During the early 1950s, such prominence for photographic images was unusual in a way that we've kind of lost sight of. Not only in publishing, but also in advertising, where drawn and painted illustrations were still the norm, and had continued to rely on a sort of ingratiatingly handmade look as accompaniments to the written advertising copy. And this was the marketplace that had encouraged Warhol's first vocation. But he would have recognized by the mid-1950s that the balance of power between illustration and photography was shifting, a change that Lustig's modern readers' book covers had anticipated. In 1956, the Art Directors Club, 4 years after having given Warhol the award for The Nation's Nightmare, gave no awards to any illustration entry whatsoever. All the awards went to, and all the exhibited advertisements for the first time featured layouts based on photographs. The ascendant photographic medium made possible a more flexible and potentially more striking application of the grid-based serial compositions that distinguished the I. Miller advertisements. In 1955, the year that Warhol and Palazzo began the I. Miller campaign, the young art director Helmut Krohn made his dramatic debut on the New York advertising scene with this full-page ad in the New York Times. An ad for an unlikely client, the previously unassuming chain of Barton's candy stores. Krohn built his composition around a symmetrical pairing, as you see, of the open candy box with its built-in grid, reinforcing the rectilinearity of the whole. The ad copy derived its entire meaning from the visual interplay between the full and empty cartons, the disorder of the empty wrappers below, emphasizing the rigorous order above. One advertising historian has said of this particular design, quote, "What Crone did in the Barton's ad was to increase the photograph's inherent veracity by putting everything in the plane of the page, like evidence. The chocolates were just there. They weren't being thrust forward, proffered by an invisible host, coming at you with perspective. The message was cool. Take it or leave it." End of quote. And Crone's success with this ad in '55 was certainly no one-off achievement. With copywriter Julian Koenig, he went on to launch the landmark series of advertisements for the struggling import automobile brand Volkswagen. Think small. Lemon being perhaps the two most famous of these, called by many the most famous advertising campaign in history. These brought to the world of advertising a skeptically ironic tone, a confidence in plain photographic documentation, and a strong reliance on modernist visual devices, their hallmark being, again to borrow Benjamin Bucklow's words, quote, "stark graphic contrast and silhouetting of forms, schematic simplification, and most important, of course, rigorous serial composition." The change in tone and in mode of address to the consumer that it was wrought by the likes of Crone and Koenig has been called the creative revolution in advertising. And it would be fair to say that the new tenor rendered Warhol's accumulated skills as an illustrator increasingly outmoded, while it made Art Kane's newly acquired skills in photographic staging an ascendant asset. Warhol would remember it later in a 1980s print series dedicated to old advertisements. Now, illustration, to be sure, did not retreat entirely, but it required stronger justification, as well as new skills in self-presentation on the part of the illustrators themselves. Against Raggedy Andy with his paper bag portfolio, there emerged the Pushpin Studio Collective, in fact composed of some of Art Kane's old Cooper Union classmates, like Milton Glaser or Seymour Chwast, which offered a range of accomplished drawing styles and inventive new typography in the bargain. Its self-published promotional periodical, the Pushpin Graphic, allied the work of the group with an eclectic and sophisticated body of knowledge, which was signaled in its varied textual content. This was a regular, freely distributed, amusing periodical sent round, of course, in the same way to solicit attention and commissions within the advertising and editorial community in New York. So you would get, for example, a whole issue devoted to Henry James in Italy, with this wonderful compression of typography on an illustration by Milton Glaser, or Apollinaire in uniform, in fact, drawn with cursive script, or a spread of Warhol-inflected pop shoes accompanying Henry David Thoreau's essay on walking. Now, by comparison, Warhol's whole style and all his old little missives to art directors, which seemed so affectingly off-center in the early 1950s, must have seemed increasingly cute and one-dimensional as time went on. Pushpin was also incubating an alliance between its own design sensibility and an irreverently dissenting political attitude, including some of the earliest graphics opposing the war in Vietnam. as photography took over more and more of the spaces available in mainstream design, the niches that remained for sophisticated hand-drawn work on the whole suited this overtly left-of-center sensibility. And in none of these directions would Warhol have been able credibly to follow. Just how out of touch he could be is evident in one of his late designs for New Directions from 1961. I'll give you a second just to take that in. It was for a new novel by this writer Alan Neame, The Adventures of Maud Noakes, which was a satirical story about a kind of obstreperous, adventurous young woman who tries to undo all of the condescending and ultimately racist missionary work that her mother was carrying on in Africa, with some side swipes at the Soviet-influenced organized left and its interventions in Africa. You know, these are the kind of complex themes, it's, you know, not an inconsequential novel, that Pushpin could have really done something with. But Warhol resorts to these lino-cut, identical kind of pickaninny faces arrayed over the surface of the novel in a way that really does little justice to the contents it's meant to solicit or advertise. But the obtuseness of his response had, as is so often the case with Warhol, a kind of perversely beneficial effect, because it pushed him into the device of stamp-like repetition that is right on the brink of the signature device that would distinguish his, you know, his first, you know, undeniable contribution as a fine artist. In this way, the emerging possibility of a pop art in blue chip galleries, a pop art in museums, provided a lucky and timely way out of his old profession, where he was increasingly a kind of fish out of water. The skill and the eye that he carried in reserve lay in his practiced way with manipulating photographs. Turning the table on the newly formidable competition in the realm of illustration, he seized instead upon what was already a commonplace in the advertising of the late 1950s and early 1960s, that is the unadorned presentation of photographic silhouettes. Disguised by the transposition of his old handmade blotting technique into photographic silk screening, it looked like nothing the fine art world had ever seen. So, thank you for your kind attention. So really, I'm happy to entertain any thoughts or questions. Yes, we have one there.
Thank you, and that was a really amazing presentation. I'm just wondering whether a component of your argument here also involves reassessing the larger terms within which Warhol, Johns, Rauschenberg are categorized as neo-avant-garde artists. Mm-hmm. And I think usually what's understood within people like Buchloh or Hal Foster's categorization of that is that they're reprising strategies and devices of the original avant-garde, the Dada and constructivism, et cetera. And there is in Buchloh and Foster, I think, a kind of ideological component to that argument where Warhol specifically is being, you know, in terms of mass culture, being critical or negating mass culture through these certain strategies. Now, in your argument, this distributed design intelligence that you discussed so fascinatingly, does that change the terms of that ideological argument? Is it no longer seen as a simple kind of negation of mass culture, the strategies that Warhol and other so-called neo-avant-garde artists employ? Or how would you parse, I guess, the ideological dimension?
Well, that's putting it really well. I mean, and my first answer is simply to say yes, it does alter those terms. Because what is great about, I mean, Buchloh in that essay on Warhol also says or reiterates a moralizing denigration or rejection, in effect, of Warhol's whole being in the world, of his vocation of everything about him as representing a form of decadence and corruption, which arises from the lament of Frankfurt School cultural critique, which has been updated as a way of looking at this work. And yeah, I think it was pretty obvious just from the substance of what I was trying to talk about today, that I find those terms, a very poor fit with the actual phenomena under discussion. If the pushpin artists are the first really to come up with an effective statement against the war, whereas fine artists trailed behind by years, even those who had overtly left affiliations, but had no means to put out a kind of visual marker or statement of that position, to give it some visibility and some memorability in graphic terms. Shouldn't we have that? I think it really does undercut the assumption of an inherent moral authority in art that is consciously, reticent, reserved, de-skilled, process-oriented, and so on, as if those were all, desirable outcomes always in and of themselves. And, I'm interested in communities of learning, of thought, of mixing, different sectors of knowledge and sensibility. And it's one of the reasons why I think the pushpin phenomenon, which of course one of the prominent partners was an African American, which is a new thing for the art world in general, Reynold Ruffins. I think the more one fills out a kind of thick anthropological description of what's going on, the less and less purchase these kind of imported schematic models tend to have. So that would be one answer to your question, but actually answering it fully would probably take as long or longer than the talk itself.
Hi, I don't have a question. I just want to say thank you. I'm familiar with your 18th century French painting, but I was not familiar, of course, with this new topic. But the extraordinary thing you bring to it is the breadth of your research is just blows my mind. You really are extraordinary in it. As you said, it's that rich anthropological, let's look at the whole picture of what was happening at the time artists were producing, to understand better a sort of a horizontal looking sideways rather than, as you said, this pulling the thread up through various art movements and so on. So I just wanted to say thanks. I'm a big fan.
Well, that's really, of course, really kind of you. I don't get that kind of response very often. It's wonderful to hear. Yeah, and you're evoking the 18th century work that it's more common and really quite mainstream to do this kind of thing if you're looking at 18th century prints or theatrical culture or something like that and thinking about that in relation to painting. And it's odd that we, in the modern field, which really should be the more expansive area, in fact, the number of sort of, how to say, validated or proper kind of topics seems to have become much narrower. And the fact that one understands or explains anything by relating it to something else. And so you're looking for things that are adjacent enough and commensurable enough with the thing that you're trying to explain to make those correspondences helpful and illuminating. But of course, you can find those adjacent points of comparison along more than one axis. So an axis that runs back through the neo-avant-garde to the historical avant-garde would be one, and I think Buchla put it to quite effective use, but then it got him into trouble. It got him into trouble on the basis of just basic chronology, that it was quite a democratic collective that went along with their political sensibility, things like that, that I think really belong in our art history.
Yeah, thanks again for the presentation. It was mainly about New York, and I'm wondering if you have comments about other pods of avant-garde mid-20th century activity like the Black Mountain School, which combined poetry and the visual arts, and also the West Coast scene with people like Berman and Keenholz and Jess Collins and Robert Duncan.
Oh yeah, I would be, I'm kind of keenly interested in all of that. I haven't paid a lot of attention to Black Mountain more than what most people know about that subject. But in Los Angeles and London, I think that that opens up, really wonderful areas of analysis. In fact, in the spring, I did a talk at UBC on a cognate subject about the journal that was produced by the Royal College in London in the late 50s, and the kind of design and illustration that went into that, which really 57 and 58 anticipated already many of the devices that become associated with pop art, strikingly so, but out of a different kind of set of inputs. The name of the magazine was ARK, A-R-K, and it's in most art school library collections. And if you go back to ARK, they were under the editorship of one editor. It was a student magazine, so it turned over all the time in terms of its staffing. Ian was there. Ian heard this. But under Roger Coleman, there were some just incredible pages produced, and use of color and sort of a lo-fi rendering of photographic material, repetition, American motifs and pop culture and so on. It was all there. In LA, there's a different set of things that one can talk about. One of the, I think, intriguing things about Pei White's sensibility, whose work is down at the power plant right now, is that she is a great enthusiast and collector of Corita Kent. Sister Corita, who was very famous in the 60s for her silkscreen posters, again, on sort of humanistic left-wing themes, and she became very vociferously anti-war and associated with the Berrigan brothers and so on as she went on, and eventually left her order. And there were huge fights with the Archbishop and so on. I mean, it was a real political battleground. And, the work, though, was immensely popular, so that it's gotten consigned to a sort of kitsch, I think, category in people's minds. But, here's, and I think Pei White's not the only one who is engaged in a kind of Sister Corita revival now. And so those are things, that we can really profitably go back and look at. Bastian Otter started out as a Sister Corita, kind of follower around 1964 and 1965, which just doesn't really go with his later historical image, but it's quite easy to see.
I had a question. Your argument is very convincing, and it brings in a lot of new thinking about this larger question of Warhol's shift as a graphic artist to the fine art world. I'm sort of interested in what your thoughts might be about his relationship as being gay, and the, you might say, the role model that maybe Johns and Rauschenberg provided for Warhol as a gay artist to explore and express kind of various kinds of camp coding or gay coding in the fine art world that maybe weren't as possible or as accessible in the world of the graphic arts, of
Yeah,
mass
well,
media.
of course, there is a lot of debate around Johns and Rauschenberg as to whether they did anything like this. And there are certain interpreters who are coming from a queer studies perspective who, do see this but see it as very coded, very indirectly expressed. Because what we have in the way of anecdotal testimony from, say, someone like their mutual friend, Emile D'Antonio, who was then, before he was making films, he was a kind of artist's agent and go-between, and he knew them all, was that that Johnson Rauschenberg stayed away from the you feel like you're going to fall into stereotypical language, but an overtly effeminate or stereotypically gay style or speech or so on, that they kept themselves back from that, with a lot of self-consciousness, that they didn't want to be seen in that way. Whereas Warhol had probably never given it a second thought. It had always been thought of like that. And what we know from, published anecdotes is that D'Antonio was the one who gave him the news, that Bob and Jap don't want to have anything to do with you because you're the style they're trying to stay away from. So that was another thing he had to do, which is to find a way to overcome that resistance without denying who he was or denying the pleasures that he derived from that style and that sensibility, which he did, ultimately find a way to do. He didn't, on the whole, he didn't need them, except this is another, maybe this will be the subject of another talk, another unexplored aspect of Warhol's transition, which was who did the first silkscreen, Rauschenberg or Warhol? This is, a real inside baseball kind of art historian's preoccupation. I tend to think that Rauschenberg's famous sort of silkscreen montage works from the 60s did get their impetus from Warhol having really cottoned on to the idea that you could make these photo silk screens and manipulate them and it could become another mode of production for painting. And he would more naturally come to it because of his experience with all kinds of reproductive techniques that go into the making mock-ups and the printing process and so on. But Rauschenberg came to see Warhol in his studio, I think with Ilyana Sonnabend, and saw what he was doing and gave him a set of family photographs from Port Arthur, Texas, with his mother and father and sister going back to the 1930s. And Warhol turned these into some really wonderful paintings called Let Us Now Praise Famous Men, evoking the Walker Evans James Agee illustrated account of rural poverty and the Depression. And you say Warhol was it was a kind of blank slate or something. I mean, this is a pretty interesting and layered set of connotations. And I think in some way, Rauschenberg is a kind of laying on of hands on Rauschenberg's part, that he was letting down this resistance and offering Warhol some access or insight into something very intimate about his formation that I think would bear some greater exploration, even though we can ask neither of them about it now. So those are just thoughts in response to your question. All right, does that seem like a good rounding off point? Thank you very much for your patient attention, everybody.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Gregory Burke, Director of the Power Plant, and welcome to this afternoon's lecture. For the 5th year running, Art Toronto has commissioned the Power Plant to develop a talks and lecture program for the fair, and we are very pleased to present this year's lineup of speakers. I would like to welcome you this afternoon to our third and final Power Talk by art historian Thomas Crow, the Rosalie Solow Professor of Modern Art and Associate Provost for the Arts at New York University. We would like to extend our thanks to our partner here and the entire Art Toronto team at the fair. Our booth at the fair features a work by the artist Ian Wallace, who spoke here yesterday and who was the subject of one of our 2 current exhibitions at the Power Plant. Wallace's exhibition, The Economy of the Image, and the Californian artist Pei White's exhibition, Material Mutters, are currently on show and feature also the result of our 2010 commissioning program. These exhibitions are on view from 12 to 6 p.m. Tuesday to Sunday. Unfortunately, we are closed tomorrow. The Power Plant is justified